Sahar Vardi is a Jewish Israeli anti-militarist activist living in Jerusalem. In 2008, she began the first of 3 prison sentences after conscientiously objecting the required military service. Sahar has served with the Israeli Committee Against House Demolitions, the Friends Service Committee, we know them as the Quakers, and the Sheikh Jarrah Solidarity Movement. Sahar is featured in the Nobel Women's Initiative and most recently helped found Hamushim, a project challenging Israel's military industry and arms trade. Thank you so much for being here today, Sahar.
Thanks for having me.
I'm very happy to speak with you. Can you tell us, first of all, how you became vegan?
So I became vegan actually through anti-occupation activism. So I got into kind of human rights work here at a pretty young age, around 12, 13, and started noticing that a lot of the people around me, a lot of the activists around me didn't eat animals. And for them, it was kind of obvious, like that if you are a human rights activist, if you're a rights activist, humans, animals, it's just all there. And I think being exposed to that from a pretty young age of just a community that said, yeah, these are our politics. And if you're gonna be fighting for justice, that's across the board and not just for humans. Just allowed me from a pretty young age to understand these things. And I became vegan when I was 14 and kind of been that way ever since.
Cool. And yeah, we hear a lot about this sort of growing vegan movement in Israel. So is it mostly among the activist community? We don't hear much about the activist community, that's for sure. Or is it sort of widespread?
It's very widespread. So actually, when I became vegan, it was a very kind of there were not a lot of vegans around. Nobody knew what vegan was, and it really was. There was a huge amount of overlap between the general activist community, like radical anarchists, human rights, all of that, and the animal rights movement. Most of the groups that we can think of that were active at the time, Israeli group called Anonymous that has nothing to do with the International Anonymous, and it's way older, and One Struggle, and different activist groups that were active on the time on animal rights, where most of them were kind of like One Struggle concept kind of activist movements. Actually, what happened is that when the animal rights movement here grew, especially in the last decade, because of a series of different activities and lectures and all kinds of things that happened, that actually shifted. So today you have a huge animal rights movement, or at least a huge amount of vegans that are not necessarily making the connections to other forms of oppression, which is great because we have more vegans, but a bit sad because I feel like some of the political depth of the movement is not as clear as it was.
Mm-hmm. The vegan movement is spreading, but not necessarily the connection to the human rights part of the equation then. So maybe they're getting, are they animal rights people, or like, because there's vegans and then there's vegan animal rights people and then there's vegan animal rights and human rights people, right? So hopefully that will all, expand and grow as we move on. So I'm interested to know about life in Israel. We don't often hear from activists, and just what's it like growing up in Jerusalem and then, becoming an activist? What inspired you to take some sympathy with the Palestinians?
Well, Jerusalem is a very complicated city, and there's also quite a few different cities within it. So we have the kind of the West Jerusalem that I grew up in, which is Jewish majority and non-Orthodox. There's a Jewish Orthodox side of the city that's another part of the city with its own story, and then there's East Jerusalem, which is the Palestinian side of the city. And they all kind of function separately. You don't actually see each other, you don't interact in many ways. And so coming from like my little bubble, I think you're like growing up in Jerusalem, I didn't feel what it meant until the Second Intifada. And that was a time of buses blowing up in the streets of Jerusalem. And suddenly like the reality of the city became real, became something that you couldn't ignore as a 11, 12-year-old. And for me, that was kind of the beginning of a politicization process. I grew up in a house where it was kind of an anti-occupation house. We knew we were against the occupation. I just didn't quite know what the occupation was or what it looked like. It was this, concept. And I was lucky enough to have opportunities as a teenager when my father was starting to also radicalize a bit, to like go to Palestinian villages, actually see realities on the grounds for Palestinians, and from there kind of be like, well, I mean, if that's the reality, and if there's such a huge gap between my reality in one side of the city and the reality of Palestinians on the other side of the city, then I have a responsibility to act upon that. So that's kind of where my activism started.
And so when you're in school, how are they explaining, your history as Israelis? How did Israel come to be? What did they tell you in school? And then what versus the reality?
I think it's not just a question of what did they tell you about actual how Israel began to be, but also what is the wider narrative that it feeds into. The final exam in high school, the kind of nationwide final exam in history, includes 3 mandatory chapters, and I think they tell the story pretty well. The 3 mandatory chapters are Second Temple period, and so the last time that there was a Jewish state in this piece of land before the modern era, right, 2,000 years ago, that ends with exile. And then fast forward, second chapter is the Holocaust. And it isn't Second World War, it's very specifically the Holocaust. And third chapter is the creation of the state. And if you just take that, I mean, the creation of the state, sure, we can talk a lot about how we hardly talk about the Palestinian villages that were destroyed in that, and this whole narrative of a land without a people for a people without a land, and all of those. I mean, they're all part of our curricula, but also the curricula has become a bit more sophisticated in that there are mentionings of periods where, or of instances of Zionist massacres of Palestinians. It's shown as this like, one out thing that wouldn't happen again is terrible, and this is why we're talking about it, and not as a norm, which it definitely was, right? Like it's presented in a specific way, but you do get some attempt for that nuance. But the bottom line is not actually about what you learn in the creation of the state. It's about what is the narrative it's part of. And the narrative that it's part of is this narrative of persecution of Jews for thousands of years, of returning to a land that is ours, that was ours. And then if there are crimes done during this return, they're justified. And I think that that's kind of important. It's not just about ignoring what happened, it's also about finding a justification for what happened.
Mm. And yet the Palestinians did not commit those crimes, right? As part of my understanding, when I was first beginning to unravel the narrative, I remember an elder Jewish fellow who, supported the newspaper that I was publishing at the time. It was a street newspaper, and he was concerned about something that I was writing, that I was publishing about, that was on the side of sort of, pro-Palestinian reporting. And he said, let me take you for lunch and explain this to you. And he talked to me for a very long time about this long, complex history and the persecution of the Jews, which I am fully aware of. I took a course at university about the rise of fascism and how all of that came to be, and I totally, understand all that. But I walked away thinking, well, I don't know now. I don't know what to think anymore. It's all kind of confused. And then, so I went and talked to a Jewish activist friend of mine, and he said, you know what? It's never anti-Semitic to criticize the actions of a state government, right? And so then I went, oh, okay, I get that. So perhaps for people who are just starting on this path, because there has been sort of a new surge, it feels like, of understanding, or at least willingness to look at this issue. And, despite the fear of being labeled anti-Semitic, none of us wants that. So perhaps you could explain to us, what's the difference between, the Jewish people and the Zionist, I guess, philosophy?
It's funny that this question's even been asked today, and it is, and it needs to be, because 150 years ago there was zero connection between those two things. And I mean, if you think about my family, Jews that came from Baghdad to live in Jerusalem and then in Hebron for purely religious reasons, had nothing to do with Zionism, couldn't care less about Zionism, moved when the Zionist movement hardly existed. And that community, for instance, the Jewish community in Hebron, was actually a community that when the Zionist militias did come to them and say, we would like to offer you protection, this was before 29, a massacre that happened in Hebron of the Jewish community, they actually told the Zionist militias, please leave us. We have nothing to do with you. So what if we're Jewish? This doesn't make us part of the same group. And I think that history, like remembering that the Zionist movement is a new movement of the 19th century. It is a movement that started in Europe with European nationalist ideas that grew up from the nationalist European nationalism that was happening in Europe, that we all know how it manifested in different places in the world, but it came from that ideology and bringing it to this land. So that's not Judaism, right? It's also not, to this day, not the majority of Jews. To this day, there are more Jews that don't live in Israel, more Jews that don't define themselves as Zionists than those who do. But I think that one of the things that Israel really tried to do from the beginning was to represent the Jewish people as a state. And that's an extremely problematic idea. The idea that a nation state, a modern nation state, can represent a people, a religion, whatever you want to call it, is extremely problematic. I mean, if today, a new nation state arises and says, I am going to represent all Greek Orthodox wherever they are, I don't think most Greek Orthodox would be cool with that, but definitely the rest of the world wouldn't say, okay, our citizens that happen to be Greek Orthodox, you now represent them. Like, no, that's not how these things work. But that is what Israel is trying to do. And when you make that equation, when you say Zionism, the ideology, and then the state that was created out of it, Israel is the manifestation of Zionism, right? When you say that and Judaism are the same thing, you're on the one hand, it's very convenient for Israel because it means that any criticism of what that state does becomes anti-Semitism. But on the other hand, it's also extremely, extremely dangerous because it also means that everything that state does represents Jews. And if you look at what that state does, right, just a few months ago in Gaza, killing, I mean, we see these numbers of children that are killed in bombings, airstrikes. Like if Israel says it represents Jews or tries to convince people it represents Jews, that becomes what represents Jews. And that's extremely dangerous, right? And that falls straight into the hands of anti-Semites that are real. And I mean, there is a lot of hatred of Jews, as there is a huge amount of different kinds of racism and xenophobia. But that just feeds them. That just falls into that. So it's so important also for us as Jews to separate that, to separate Judaism from Zionism or Israel from Judaism.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thank you. And in a webinar where I first met you, you talked about how the response to anti-Semitism and the response to the horrors of the Holocaust is a militaristic response, and that really made sense to me. I thought, that that made sense. Do you want to explain that further?
Sure. I think I'll just give an example of a moment that was very telling for me, and I imagine something that a lot of North Americans, at least, remember the Pittsburgh shooting just a few years ago in the synagogue. And I think that one of the interesting things that happened after that is that you had here something that was clearly an anti-Semitic attack. In retrospect, we can say also it was like part of a general racist, xenophobic attack, but it was very clearly an anti-Semitic attack. And the first response from the Israeli government, Netanyahu was the prime minister at the time, was more or less saying the Jewish community in the US and Pittsburgh, wherever, should move here where we can protect them. That was kind of more or less the response.
Wow.
Trump's response, that was even more immediate, obviously in a tweet, like everything he ever said, was that there needs to be security guards at the entrance of every synagogue, right? Both those responses in different ways are militarized responses. They're saying there is a threat to Jews, from anti-Semitism. And response to that should be either security guards or move to a state where that has a military that'll protect you. But either way, it's a military solution. Most of the community in the Jewish community in Pittsburgh, the response was completely different, right? If you actually saw what happened there afterward, it was much more about like work in the community and the neighboring mosque doing projects together and rebuilding, and like it was about saying, oh, we have a problem here of racism in our community, and how do we target that? And that also means targeting the Republican Party that is supporting, white supremacy and whatever, but in a way, but with a concept of we are fighting racism. You don't fight racism with guns. We're not about protecting ourselves. We're about how do we break down those racist movements within our society in the US, right? Those are both solutions to anti-Semitism. One of them is militarizing, one of them really isn't. And I think for me, the interesting thing about that is that we as Israelis don't see that second option as an option, because the state that we live in and therefore our education system and the entire construction of Zionist identity is based on saying the solution to anti-Semitism is creating a state with its own military and everything that means about the monopoly of power and eventually a militarized solution to anti-Semitism. It's the only way we can think. And it's the only way we can think as a state, which means it's also a state that doesn't look for other solutions. In Hebrew, we call it living on our sword, right? This is how we survive, by fighting. And that's an extremely sad and also very short-term way to think of life.
Well, and the money incentive, right? Then it becomes an essential part of the economy, and look at the US, that's what happened to them. They essentially grew a war economy out of World War II, and clearly that isn't functioning very well for them in these times. And the US has a rather large military and trade that I didn't really understand until I heard you speaking, and I'd like to talk about that. But first, what does it mean to say, no, I'm not going to do a military service? And is military service a requirement for every citizen of Israel?
So military service is mandatory in Israel for both men and women. At the age of 18, it's 2 years for women and 3 years for men. There are a few ways out of it. Women who are either married or pregnant or mothers don't have to serve in the military. As our first prime minister said, they're already doing their part.
Oh my.
But religious women don't have to go. You can get out through mental health and compatibility. There's a whole array of ways of getting out of military service, like I think there is in every draft. I'm sure that some people in Canada know a couple of Americans who moved there back in the Vietnam days to dodge the draft. There's always ways out. But if you choose to publicly refuse and say, I am refusing because of the occupation in what's seen in Israel as a political refusal, the military does not recognize political refusal as conscientious objection. So if you are refusing because of the occupation, therefore they don't think you're a conscientious objector, which is a very interesting definition. But then that means you do go to prison. So it's usually for a few months. Currently, we have a guy who just got out of prison a week ago, finished his last term and was released. There's another guy who's currently in prison. So this is ongoing. There's always 18-year-old kids who would rather sit in prison than be part of the military or be part of the occupation. And I think it's interesting because it's also people who get a chance because of the draft to voice their concerns, to talk about the occupation, to talk about why they're refusing. So in a way, the draft also kind of forces young people who are politically aware to take a stand.
And what is it like inside prison, and how long were you there?
I spent about 2 months in prison and 3 months in detention. It's a military prison. It's mostly extremely boring. I don't have a lot to say about it. I think that the main thing that I can say about it is that beyond the routine of what it means, which was a lot of drills and cleaning our barracks twice a day and all kinds of extremely boring, but not very dramatic things. What I will say about prison, and I assume this is true for most prisons, is that there is something about losing your freedom that you can't quite explain. It's not about the conditions themselves. It's not about what life looks like there. It's about the idea that you do not have freedom. And I don't think I can explain that in any way, shape, or form. But I do think that going through that process also makes you understand much more why people fight for freedom, and not just people. In this case, also why animals deserve freedom. And it's not just a question of conditions, right? It's not just a question of how good or not your life is. There is something about being able to make choices about your life that we can't explain exactly in tangible terms.
Yeah. Yeah, the freedom to live your own life on your own terms, as long as you're not hurting anybody else. That's a very valuable resource for sure. And so, what was it when you were in East Jerusalem? And have you been to the West Bank or Gaza? I'm just. Can we get a sense of what is going on for the Palestinians that keeps you doing the work that you're doing?
So I will start to say by saying that I've never been to Gaza, and that's true for my entire generation. Post the disengagement in 2006, Gaza has been under siege since, and nobody goes in and out. I mean, here and there people can get permits to get out, but Israelis cannot enter Gaza, and Palestinians can very rarely leave it. And so there's a huge disconnect there.
So, is it true to say that I've heard it described as the largest open air prison in the world? Would you agree with that?
Yeah, I mean, Gaza has over, I think at this point, 1.8 million people in the most densely populated place in the world that Israel controls de facto all of its borders, including the border with Egypt. Israel can decide what does and doesn't happen there through agreements, which de facto means that for Palestinians to leave, and again, I'm not saying that nobody ever leaves, but for Palestinians to leave, they need authorization from Israel. So if we look, for instance, now in this COVID year, that's hardly happened at all, including for medical reasons and very extreme cases. Most of them were denied. So in effect, yes, it's a prison that the prison guard can decide when to be a bit nicer and let some people out for a bit and when not. And that is also a huge amount of power that Israel holds, which is true generally for prisons. Prisons need not only to give sticks, but also to give carrots. And we see that in any prison system because it's part of a control mechanism. And we see that as well in Gaza. So that's regarding Gaza. And so that's a place that I've never had a chance to be in, and do hope that one day soon when it is liberated, we'll be able to, but for now. For the West Bank and East Jerusalem, I think it's important to say, first of all, for the people who kind of haven't been here or haven't seen it, when we talk about East Jerusalem, which according to international law is occupied land and should be a Palestinian area, in effect, we're talking about an area that has no separation between where I'm sitting right now, which is city center, West Jerusalem, about a 3-minute walk from what used to be the Green Line, the line between the 48 borders and 67 borders, or international law speaking, everything 3 minutes away from me and onwards is occupied. But there's nothing that will show me that. I'll be able to just walk, go into the next Palestinian neighborhood and not notice that I'm theoretically crossing an international border that doesn't exist. And so when we talk about East Jerusalem, like most Israelis have been to East Jerusalem and haven't even noticed that they have. There's 300,000 Israelis who live in East Jerusalem in settlements, and most of them don't even know that they are settlers. That according to international law, that's a violation. They don't even know that. It's the same public transport system that goes there. They go to the same schools like in West Jerusalem. Like the whole system is created to normalize this occupation completely. So usually when you ask Israelis if they've been to East Jerusalem and they say no, they mean they haven't been within a Palestinian neighborhood. But they've actually been to East Jerusalem a lot. So I also had the opportunity to actually go into Palestinian neighborhoods, and especially those who are having like different struggles against the occupation. And those struggles kind of differ, but the main issues in East Jerusalem are, first of all, house demolitions. We're talking about at any given moment, there are a few thousand houses that have pending demolition orders, meaning any morning the municipality can come and demolish that house. And that has been an issue for dozens of years. And the reason is that the municipality will not give building permits for Palestinians, and therefore eventually they build illegally because they can't get a legal building permit, and then that house is demolished. So it's all in a very bureaucratic system, but in effect, it means that people never feel safe in their home. And that's a very strong, again, mechanism of control and of making people leave the city. And it's important to state this idea of leaving the city because Jerusalem residents, Palestinians who live in Jerusalem, are not citizens of the state like I am. So on the one hand, the city looks like one city, and I can cross over and never notice that I'm in a different place. But people around me will not have a citizenship, any citizenship. What they have is a residency, which I don't know what the Canadian equivalent would be, but it operates a lot like a green card in the US. So you will get, Social Security and you can work and you can live somewhere, but you can't vote. But more importantly, if you leave the country, exactly like a green card, you lose it, right? Only these are not immigrants. These are people who the state came to them, right? People who were born here before the state even existed and have that temporary residency, which means that if they, for instance, after their house is demolished, decide to move to Ramallah, to the closest Palestinian city, they are technically leaving the country, quote unquote, and therefore will lose their residency and lose their right to come back into the city that they were born into. So that's the displacement that's happening in East Jerusalem.
So the house is demolished and then the land is reclaimed by the state and sold as real estate, or how does that work?
Not necessarily. In most cases, the land still is still owned by its Palestinian owner. They just can't do anything with it.
Okay.
So it works just as well. They don't lose the property, but if you can't build a house in a piece of property in the middle of an urban area, what are you going to do with it? And so people still have to leave because they need to live somewhere. They need a home. The other kind of issues that we see and that have recently been a lot in the headlines are evictions of homes, and that is cases in which Palestinian homes are evicted and Israeli settlers are put in their place. I can explain about the legal context of it. It's rather complicated, but the bottom line of it is that there are areas in East Jerusalem that were, before 1948, had Jews living in them, because before 1948, this whole separation of East and West did not exist. And so Jews lived in what's now East Jerusalem just as much as they did in West Jerusalem, like Palestinians lived in what's now East Jerusalem just as much as they did in West Jerusalem. But at the end of the war, when that 1948 border was put in place, there were refugees from both sides. There were about 3,000 Jewish refugees that fled East Jerusalem to the west, and about 30,000 Palestinian refugees that fled from West Jerusalem to the east, and added to them a few, in Jerusalem, a few dozens of thousands of Palestinian refugees that came from other places. Generally, there were over 700,000 Palestinian refugees from that war. And so what happens now is that settler movements find the people who had houses in East Jerusalem, Jews who had houses in East Jerusalem before 1948, and reclaim that land for them and evict Palestinian families. Just to add to the irony of that, every single one of those Palestinian families that is evicted has a house in Israel, either in West Jerusalem or Haifa or Tel Aviv, somewhere that they got kicked out of in the war, that they became refugees from. They can't claim that land back. There's a law that just makes it very clear that one side can claim it back and the other ones can't. So that's like the evictions that we're hearing about now. Add to that a huge amount of police violence. We're talking about neighborhoods that have had for a year and a half straight nightly raids every single night that include tear gas and arrests and things of the sort. The amount of issues in East Jerusalem, we can really go on for hours just about that, but it's very clear that goal of all of those is just to make Palestinians leave the city, because the moment they leave it, they can't come back.
Right. And so when people describe an apartheid situation, that's what they're referring to.
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of examples of how this is apartheid. This, when we're talking about East Jerusalem, you see that difference in legal status. You see the difference of access to the legal framework that allows one side to claim land from before 48 and another one not to. That there's a lot of things when you go into the West Bank. It's even more so because Palestinians in the West Bank have a Palestinian ID card that, again, is not any form of citizenship. But when I go to West Bank, to those same areas, I bring Israeli law with me. It's a very strange legal system in which Palestinians are under military law, and me as a citizen, even if I go to the same areas that they're at, I am somehow under Israeli law because I'm a citizen. So, I mean, those are some of the technical aspects that you say, obviously that's apartheid. Those are two different legal systems according to who you are. That's more or less the definition of apartheid. I think that when we talk about apartheid, one of the important things to remember is that this is not about a comparison to South Africa, which we can definitely make, but in any comparison between two historical situations, there will be differences because no two historical situations will ever be the same thing. The question is the crime of apartheid, which is a crime that says, according to who you are, to your ethnic group or religious group or racial group, that is what defines the rights that you have, and that there are different legal systems depending on that. And that is what we are seeing here.
Mm-hmm. All right, well, let's talk about, is it Hamushim? Is that how it's pronounced?
Hamushim, yeah.
Hamushim. And what does that word mean? And what is it all about?
So Hamushim is the Hebrew word for armed. And it's a project that started really from a realization, and there's been a bit of discourse about it throughout the years, of how much Israel uses the occupation as both a testing field, but probably more importantly, a marketing opportunity for weapons. The idea that Israel can prove its weapons as battle proven because it constantly has battles to try them in, and then sell them as that. There's a label attached to that, and that label is worth money. And we see how, a drone will be used in an attack in Gaza, and the next summer will be sold around the world as, look what this drone can do. Here's footage from the last attack that it was involved in, actual, again, proven evidence of its success, as opposed to the competitors that would have to use nice 3D imagery or whatever, because they haven't bombed anyone with it yet. And that is generally something that we see in the arms industry, that whatever is battle proven sells better. And Israel has a lot of opportunities to do that. And so the project was born from a place of saying, well, we know that this is part of a reality. We need to start talking about, we need to start looking at it, but also we need to start looking at where those weapons go around the world, because Israel refuses to make transparent where we export arms to. So Israel doesn't report to the UN Registry on Conventional Arms, which is theoretically something that states are supposed to do when they sell or receive weapons. And so we don't actually know where Israeli weapons go. And we only find out when they're involved in something, when there's pictures that come out, or like now there was a huge issue around an Israeli company called NSO, which is a spyware company. It has a very sophisticated spyware tool called Pegasus that takes over people's phones, and it was just revealed that it was used in a huge amount of countries against journalists, against human rights activists. Even there was a request against Macron's phone. So state leaders of different kinds. And so we only learn about these Israeli weapons being used when someone reveals it from the user side. Because Israel doesn't even, is not willing to say to what countries it sells, and has zero human rights restrictions on those sales. So there's no law that says you cannot sell to someone who commits gross human rights violations. That's just not in our legal system, which means that a lot of markets, quote unquote, that are closed for Europe, Canada, the US, because of human rights violations, Israel can sell arms to, and does.
And groups like the Taliban, I suppose.
Probably not directly. I mean, there still is, like, the state will still decide what its own security interests are. And one can assume that arming the Taliban isn't currently Israel's security interest. But those arms definitely go around. And that's another thing that people need to understand about the arms trade. And obviously, we see that with American weapons, and we see it with Israeli weapons and a lot of other weapons. Even if you decide you are not selling to XYZ, you don't know what's going to happen with those weapons in 5 years. I think when you looked at fighters in Syria, it was the clearest, because every fighter in Syria had arms from at least 6 different countries on them, just because there were so many things around, and people used them. So, like, this is also something we need to understand about arms, is that they stay around and their effects stay around. And now, yeah, if we're talking about the US leaving Afghanistan, the weapons that they left there throughout the years of occupation are going to be used against civilians by everyone.
Right? Well, that's already going on, I think.
Yeah, for sure. And that's and that should somehow also be the responsibility of people selling those arms. There's a first responsibility to say, you cannot sell to someone who's committing human rights violations right now, which we don't even do. But there's another layer over that says you should also make sure that those weapons won't be used later for human rights violations.
Yeah.
And honestly, the best way to do that is just not sell weapons.
Right.
That's really the only forward way.
Yeah, you can't. How do you tag a weapon and where it's going to end up? I mean, it's like a car, you sell it and 5 other people sell it down the road, and who knows where it ends up. Yeah. And it's a huge trade. It's a huge trade. And I think people don't really get how insidious it is in terms of, I know someone in Canada, for example, who worked for a company that had a contract with, a software company, right? Just a software company. They make whatever software this was back 20 years ago, 30 years ago. But they had a contract with U.S. And what they call defense contract. I don't really see what's defensive about any of it, but and so they were building, part of their company was building some software that was used in some component that was connected to some weapon. I mean, the tentacles of this industry are just everywhere, and nice people that we know in our neighborhood, could be working somehow directly connected to these weapons that are killing the children of Palestine. And I think we really need to get a grip on that and have a good look at it. But it's all kind of hush-hush, as all things are that we're not supposed to investigate. So in terms of Canada, like, what is the relationship between Israel and Canada? And the Canadian government does have some limits on who will sell arms to, I think, and for what purposes. But does that really have any impact?
Not in our context. So Canada does have, as you said, human rights restrictions within export laws. The problem is that in Canada, like in any other country in the world, they are used extremely politically. In Canada, probably the bigger campaigns that have been around this have been around Canada selling arms to Saudi Arabia, where, again, we know that human rights violations are happening. We know their part in the violations in Yemen. Like, we know all of these things, and yet Canada continued to sell arms there. And there was a moment they were talking about a freeze. But the reason that they could do that, even though there's a law in place, is that these laws are used politically. Which means that even, and we see this in the case of Israel, even if theoretically, in the case of Israel, Canada should not be selling arms to Israel, again, because of what those arms will do, which is not just a gross violation of human rights, which you can say, okay, how do I define that? What is very clear is that every single weapon that is sold to Israel will be used in a breach of international law, because that's what occupation is. And so there's really no question about it. It's kind of a black and white situation. And yet none of these countries that have these laws implement them on Israel. And that is political. And that goes back to, it's easy for a country to say, oh, we're not going to sell arms to South Sudan. because there's genocide going on for a few reasons. First of all, the amount of arms they sold to South Sudan anyway was not financially meaningful. So it's not going to affect their industry. So, okay, you can do that. Secondly, because the political power of South Sudan is extremely small, and it doesn't have the ability to kind of lobby and say, no, you shouldn't be doing this to us, da, 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 da. And another reason is racist, pure racist. It's much easier for Western countries to think about those faraway non-Western countries where people do terrible human rights abuses. Okay, we should, from a very colonial perspective, we should be educating them and not teach, like, that's the stick, right? We shouldn't be selling weapons to them because da, da, da. And when it's those countries committing human rights violations, when it's the US or when it's Israel or when then we don't have any restrictions on that. We're not, like, it's a very colonial and racist perspective as well. So you layer all of those things together, these laws are not going to be used against Israel. And what that means is if states aren't going to do that, and hopefully that is slowly shifting, and we're seeing a bit of people talking about it. In the last attack on Gaza, we did see Congress in the US at least slow down a shipment of guided munition. But if we know that states are not going to be the first to act on this, and they're definitely not going to implement their laws in a just way, because they implement them politically throughout the world, then the question is, what do we do, right? Because the arms industry isn't just something that governments are involved in. So for instance, your pension fund is invested in Elbit Systems, which is an Israeli company that creates drones that were, we can actually say specifically some of the drones that were responsible for bombings of children in Gaza. We have incidents documented. They are also doing technology on the wall, not only the wall here, by the way, also the wall between the US and Mexico, and involved in a series of human rights violations across the globe, but mostly here against Palestinians. That's your pension funds profiting from that. I mean, it's not just you're funding it, you're profiting from that, right? And that's the place where we should, as citizens, take responsibility and try to understand what we could do about that. I will just drop a couple of useful tools for that, especially for those in North America. There's a website called Investigate, investigate.afsc, I think, or afsc.investigate. If you Google the two things together, you will find it, which allows you to put your own investment portfolio onto the platform, and it'll flag for you the companies that you are invested in that are involved both in the occupation here, but also in incarceration in the US and immigration. You can really put filters on of saying, what are the things I care about and don't want my money to be involved in, and just get an answer of what are the companies that you are currently invested in. And that's obviously a tool for people who do have some kind of control of their investment. But when we talk about things like a pension fund, which you don't actually control, then it becomes pressuring them. It becomes coming to them saying, we refuse to have our money invested in this in campaigns. So there's different ways to kind of act on that, but I think that is an important thing that we should be looking at.
Right. Yeah, thank you. That's really important. I remember hearing about, I think it was the Ontario Teachers Federation that was able to divest I'm sorry, I don't have the details in my brain, but I know I have heard of activities in that regard. We're so many battles to be waging here with climate crisis and everything else, but that's an important one to investigate further. All right, let's shift gears entirely then and talk about your cabaret. I'm sorry to hear about your mother's passing, but it's a very joyful thing that you're doing, bringing this cabaret. Do you want to tell us about that?
Yeah, so 13 years ago, my mother passed away from breast cancer. And towards the end, one of the things that she did to deal with it was really write wrote a cabaret that she never got to finish, but almost about dealing with cancer. It's a very out there production with a huge amount of humor and criticism and a lot of other different things. She for many years decided not to go with kind of mainstream or conventional medicine, so radiation and all of those things, but tried a lot of alternative medicine. And mostly for her, it was a lot of a journey of kind of understanding where cancer came from for her. Like, what are the things in her life that made her body do that, and what are the things that needed attention and needed to change, from a place of saying like that this is cancer is our body. I mean, it comes from our body, right? It's not something external, and so it is our body saying that there needs to be something that will be different. And for her, a lot of it was a journey of understanding what that something is. And I think this musical was another way to write about it, to understand what her journey was, including the parts that didn't work with that, right? Like eventually she didn't make it to be 50. And I think there's always this conversation between alternative medicine and conventional medicine and the people that are somewhere in the between and all of that. And I think that, yeah, the musical explores a lot of that. And it's a weird experience to be producing this thing now. But it's about time. So yeah, that's a lot of what I'm doing over the next month. Yeah.
It's cool. And so was she a musician herself then, or did she just write this?
Not at all. She was an artist. She did mostly patchwork. She worked with textile. And this was just another place that she was like, well, this is what I want to do now. So what better time to try than the present when you don't have much of a present. So
Awesome. So are you, well, what a wonderful legacy for her to leave for you. What a great project, right? And are you now you're working with musicians to try to figure out how to make this musical, and will it be sort of a theatrical production or an audio experience?
yes, it's a theatrical production. We'll see with COVID restrictions when it'll actually be able to get on stage, but hopefully the end of September. We have a director, a musician, an amazing choreographer, like a whole cast. I mean, it's really happening. It's also really interesting to see how they interpret the text and to remember that, like, she wrote something 13 years ago, and now all these other amazing women. It's an all women staff. I mean, not all the actors, but everyone around it, and kind of what they put into it. And everyone has some kind of experience of loss or cancer, or like, it's unfortunately something that is so yeah. Really, everyone has some kind of experience with it. So it's really interesting to see how people put themselves also into this, and kind of are creating this new creature that is yeah, I think partially an opportunity for us as a family to kind of see my mother on stage again, and partially not just her, but like a lot of other things as well.
Right, so cool. Well, I hope you're going to record it for us so we can see too.
Yeah, I mean, it's going to be in Hebrew.
Okay.
So this is going to be that language challenge. But yeah, there will be also the soundtrack that we're going to record, and we'll record the thing itself. And learning Hebrew is a big deal. So yeah.
All right. Well, I look forward to that. And thank you so much for your time today. There's so much more we could explore, but I feel like for people who are maybe just now stepping on to this path of trying to unravel what's happening, we can be friends in the struggle. Like, we don't, I feel there's a lot of vitriol that comes up when we talk about, from this distance, trying to understand what's going on. And I think that you've helped us put a lot of pieces into the puzzle so we can maybe more calmly and rationally just have a look at just the facts of what's happening there. Is there anything you want to say before we go, Sahar?
I'll just say that there's a huge amount of resources from news outlets like Plus 972 magazine or Electronic Intifada that update about what's happening here, to NGOs like Hack or B'Tselem that put reports about what's happening here. So there's a huge amount of ways to see kind of what's happening, and also to get involved with campaigns. And again, There's the Independent Jewish Voices in Canada that are doing a lot of campaigning about these issues. There's a lot of other groups. So just find kind of what's relevant in your area to learn more and see if you want to act on it.
Right on. All right. Thank you so much for all the work that you're doing.
Thank you.